a lecturer at Kansai University, and I'm also a PhD student at Osaka University. And today's presentation is actually about the first research part of my PhD, which I did throughout the past year. So I'm going to focus on attitudes, knowledge, and skills that are required for globally competent students. I'm particularly focusing on higher education institutions in the quest for these global jinsai, or globally competent human resources. I'll give you some background first and my methodology, and then I'll go into the findings of this research. So there's a lot of talk about internationalization in Japan. I think it has been a recurring topic today. I think the most common and widely accepted definition is that it is the process of integrating an international, cultural, or global dimension into the purpose, functions, or delivery of post-secondary education. This is very relevant for Japan. Japan has really been focusing on internationalization of higher education institutions by bringing in international students, adding a global dimension to the curricula, and also an intercultural aspect. So in Japan, it has been historically promoted, here actually first of all, promoted, encouraged, and funded by the Japanese government. Some of these internationalization strategies have focused on bringing in international students to Japan, such as the International Student 100,000 Plan and the 300,000 foreign students plan. Other strategies have focused on developing internationalization programs within the universities, as was the case of the Global 30, the Go Global Japan, and more recently the Top Global University Project. This idea of internationalization has really been connected to the quest for global jinsai, or global human resources. These were defined as those who possess rich linguistic and communication skills and intercultural experiences and thrive internationally. So very nice and vague, like we are used to in Japanese documents. But there's really an emphasis on linguistic skills and flexibility and understanding of other cultures. This evolved alongside mixed initiatives, not only in higher education institutions, but also at the industry level. And the main goal is, of course, to enhance global competitiveness of Japan at the educational level and again at the business level. Still, this concept remains fairly vague. This is not a problem that's exclusive to Japan. Other countries are struggling with the same idea, as well as concepts of global citizenship and global education and so on. But it is a problem in Japan. I decided to link this concept of global jinsai to the concept of intercultural competence, which is more in my field of research, and is defined as the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations based on one's knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So we can see that although the concepts are not they do not completely overlap. There is a lot of overlap here in the intercultural situations, in the fact that they want the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes in the students to be able to communicate effectively and get their message across. However, there is no current model of global jinsai. I think there is not even a list of traits that define global jinsai. And the models of intercultural competence that are widely accepted and used do not really match what we are using right now. So to give you some examples, there's the development model of intercultural sensitivity, there's various acculturation model, and more recently, Beardorf's pyramid model of intercultural competence. But none of them really seem to match the Japanese context, the Japanese higher education context, and that's what we are focusing on right now. So what I wanted to do is consider this idea of global jinsai with a focus on intercultural competence specifically in the context of higher education institutions. for that, I decided to focus on the Top Global University project. And I did this for several reasons. First of all, it's the latest project. It started in 2014 and it's still ongoing, which is an advantage. It's not finished, so we can see how it is developing. Also, there is a focus on internationalization here. English, GMI courses, multicultural campuses, and internationalized curricula and co-curricula. And then, in an effort to become more transparent, a lot of documents have been published regarding this program, which makes it easier, in a way, to see what universities want and what they expect from students by the time they graduate. There's a lot of information available. So my goal was really to identify attitudes, knowledge, and skills desirable to global Jinsai as established by Japanese higher education stakeholders. And I did this by analyzing policy and promotional materials published by two parties. On the one hand, the Japanese government, of course, next and some other agencies who are relevant. And I looked at policy documents, project announcements, and also the official Top Global University website that they created. On the other hand, I looked at the 37 top global universities individually. So each of the universities has an individual page within this Top Global University project website. In addition, most of them have pages about the Top Global University project on their official websites, which I also looked at. And they published reports annually describing activities that have been planned or activities that have been carried out. So those were the documents I based my research on. So my first step was to retrieve keywords related to the attitudes, knowledge, and skills associated with global Jinsai. Many of the keywords were the same in all of these documents. Some of them differed, but they portrayed similar concepts. And then I decided to consider them within a framework of analysis of Theodore's pyramid model of intercultural competence that I mentioned before. And the reason why I chose this was because in this model, Theodore considers 22 components of intercultural competence that have been widely accepted by scholars in North America and Europe as representatives of intercultural competence. This was a very Western-centric model, which I was aware of when I was comparing it to the Japanese context. But I thought, actually, this is a good framework of comparison. So in this way, I could see what were the common aspects to global Jinsai that were showing up in Japan and also in the West, and which aspects were specific to Western ideology and to the Japanese rhetoric, in a way. So, for my findings, and I'll talk about three parts. The first is the widely shared components that were both in Theodore's model and in the Japanese policy and promotional documents. Then I'll talk about the ones that are shared but not widely shared. And then I'll talk about the ones that are only present in one or the other. So the widely shared components, in terms of attitudes, some of the most popular ones were openness, understanding the value of cultural diversity, withholding judgment, curiosity, and ethno-relative view. Then in terms of knowledge, understanding others' worldviews, self-awareness, empathy, understanding the role and impact of culture and culture-specific knowledge, and skills, adaptability, flexibility, and skills to analyze, interpret, and relate. So these were components that were present both in Theodore's model of intercultural competence and in the Japanese context, widely represented. The ones that are in blue were the ones that had the highest percentage of frequency in the document, so those were strongly emphasized. I think these are actually not very interesting on their own. I think that if we had had a brainstorming session before the presentation, talk about what is intercultural competence or what students need, a lot of these would have come up. They are fairly standard in the way people think. But then for the divergent components. So there were a few that were not at all mentioned in the Japanese context, specifically 4 that had been in Deardorff's model, but not at all in the Japanese context, that included skills to listen and to observe, and tolerating and engaging ambiguity, and then also cognitive flexibility and social linguistic competence. Personally, I don't think it's very strange that they are not in mixed promotional and policy documents. Skills to listen and to observe, tolerating and engaging ambiguity are to some extent embedded in Japanese culture and perhaps not really feel necessary to mention those explicitly. And then cognitive flexibility, social linguistic competence, let's be honest, they are not the most attractive terms to put in promotional materials or in materials that are open to a general audience. They are difficult to understand. Empathy or curiosity are much more attractive. So actually, I think that the most telling of these components are the ones that are rarely mentioned in the Japanese context. And that is because MEXT is obviously aware of them. Universities are obviously aware of them, but they are not strongly emphasized. And that includes the ability to adapt to varying intercultural communication and learning styles, a deep knowledge and understanding of culture, respect for other cultures, mindfulness, and learning through interaction. So these are still considered important by some of the institutions, but not by all. They are rarely mentioned. Then, of course, we need to consider that the Japanese specific context has components that are not at all considered in the West, or in the Western model. Unsurprisingly, those included foreign language and English language skills. So this was a point that the Deardorff scholars could not agree on, whether foreign language, knowing a foreign language skill was important to intercultural competence. And I guess coming from an English-speaking country, most of them from America, you would probably not think it necessary. Whereas in Japan, not only is it emphasized, it was one of the highest or more frequently mentioned components. I think at least half of them mentioned foreign language skills. The ones that didn't say foreign language skills said English language skills. So between the two of them, I think about 100% of the sources mentioned some sort of language ability. Then other components that were not mentioned in Deardorff's model, but also in the Japanese context, are, in my opinion, components that obviously emphasize a gap or perceived gaps in the Japanese educational system. And that includes critical and logical thinking skills, willingness to take challenges, then awareness of local and global issues, which personally I think my students do not really have much of. Or some of them are components that are important in the Japanese cultural context, such as cooperativeness or a sense of Japanese national identity or an ability to cultivate relationships with the global community. So these were also strongly emphasized. Then some other components of global Jinsai that were not related to cultural competence were more geared towards the professional market. And those included, for example, innovation, leadership skills, which we've heard about today quite a lot, and of course, specialized knowledge. So these are also parts of what components of global Jinsai as perceived by MEXT and as perceived by the top global universities that are now leading internationalization in Japan. So, what does it mean? We have a nice list, but what are the implications of these results? So I'll talk about the implications for policymakers first, and then I'll talk about the implications for higher education institutions a little bit. So in terms of policymakers, there needs to be a reconsideration of global Jinsai and the role of intercultural competence in global Jinsai. It's not a universal concept. The perceptions depend on geographical, political, cultural factors, and this is something that needs to be considered. I think it would be probably amazing, incredible, and impossible to reach a definition of global Jinsai that would be accepted worldwide. Then another implication is that policy makers need to be aware and understanding of the differences. Especially when comparing Japan to other countries, which we constantly do, when competing for worldwide rankings, which is a huge component of university goals at this moment, when importing educational systems and practices into Japan, which Japan has a long history of doing, and when developing new internationalization strategies. So how does Japan want to internationalize? Is not the things that will work for Japan are not the same things that will work for America or Europe or other countries. And then for higher education institutions, more at the micro level program, both curricular and co-curricular assessment beyond numerical targets. What are participants learning? Which of these components of global Jinsai? How are they learning? And what are the obstacles to the development of these components? A need for program design, redesign, focus on specific limited number of attitude, knowledge, and skills, and also continuous design means the design needs to match whatever is happening and whatever skills are needed that year, that month, the next 5 years. It needs to continue being upgraded. And then what is the role of faculty and staff? This is something that is very often left out, but if the faculty and the staff are not interculturally competent, if the faculty and the staff are not global human resources themselves, how can we teach our students to do so? So some future steps is a growing consensus would be nice to provide some guidance for higher education institutions and also to provide a clear image of what Japanese graduates and internationalization in Japan means. And of course, a need to address gaps between implementation and rhetoric with realistic targets and relevant forms of assessment. Thank you. Over my 20 minutes. I think we still have a few minutes. 2 minutes for questions. Yes.
When I look at Japanese universities' professional careers, I find it very difficult actually to notice which one is which because they're all kind of the same. When you went through your data, did you find all of the university descriptions being very similar to each other?
Yes and no. Most of it would be yes. There are exceptions. There are some of the top global universities are technical institutes and medical schools. Those really address specific skills. If we're talking about universities with a wider range of faculties, a lot of it is similar. But what we really choose to focus on depends on the faculties they have. I also made a list of programs and initiatives and strategies they are developing, which we're not talking about today. But they seem to go in slightly different directions depending whether they're type A and they want to focus on research, or type B if they want to bring in more international students. So that also plays. Yes.
I noticed you used the word internationalization a lot, and I had kind of gotten the sense that that was a term we were using 10 or 15 years ago, and that it was kind of being replaced by globalization. So I wondered if you're finding it in the literature still, or?
I feel like in terms of educational research, what I see a lot is internationalization as a product of globalization, almost, or as an influencing factor. So internationalization being more the development of strategies at the higher education level, with being impacted by globalization forces that have to do with markets and the economy. So So that was the feeling that I got, and that's how I took it. Thank you.
Can I address that point? Because the difference from the government's point of view is that I think internationalisation is no threat to the nation. It's just nations interacting more with each other. Globalisation potentially could be a real threat, but too much interaction.
Yes, so there is that feeling. Internationalization, funnily enough, in Japan is almost seen as something that can be contained within the higher education institution through programs and strategies. Let's internationalize does not necessarily mean let's communicate and be open to outside influence. It's something that can be done within the institution. So I think there's a lot of
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very
Thank you.
much. We can pick that back up then, or we have the reception afterwards. These conversations.